Hey guys, it's Jackie. Welcome back to my channel. So I thought for this week's video I would do something that I have never done before, but it's something I'm noticing as a trend on Booktube right now, which is these tier maker, rankings of books that people have read. So rankings of YA novels, rankings of fantasy series, rankings of characters named Adam, just like anything that the Booktube community can rank. It seems like we're going to try to for fun, and I think it's an interesting little trend. And I think the first time I remember seeing it was Chandler last year, where she did her her very funny video where she was like ranking like what are considered to be like, oh, the god tier of YA novels and series, and like putting them in the order in which she would rank them. And it's one of my favorite Booktube videos. It is so funny. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. I'm sure you probably have if you're into Booktube, but I highly recommend checking that video out. But in the last couple of months, I've definitely noticed that these ranking videos have become kind of like a new meme in the community. So I thought that I would go ahead and try to put like my own spin on it. So what I've decided to do is to rank, and I'm going to get very small now, is to rank all of the books that I have taught as an instructor. Which, looking at this list, seems really small to me. I've taught now for about 6 years. I have total teacher brain right now. Like my teacher hat is kind of on, because I am currently mocking up, brainstorming, workshopping a course that I'm going to be teaching in less than 2 weeks over the summertime, which is my first time teaching a really intensive literature course online, because we're going fully online because of COVID-19. So it's going to be really interesting. So I kind of have teaching on the brain right now. So I thought that this would be sort of fun. But looking at this, like, this number of text feels very small to me, because I have chosen to include only books that I have taught. And when I say books, I mean novels, novellas, plays, graphic narratives, and collections of short stories or poetry, where I feel like I've taught enough of that collection, or enough of the stories inside of it, that I can, you know, say that I've taught the book. Things I didn't include, which if I had included them, this list would probably, again, quadruple in size, are things like films I've taught, TV shows I've taught, marketing, concept albums and musical theater. Like I've taught Hadestown and Hamilton a couple of times. Those aren't here. And I also did not include stories or short form poems. I did include long form poems, but short form poems or one-off stories. So if it's like, oh, I taught a story by William Faulkner that one time, I didn't include it here. So anyway, the rankings that I have made available for ranking all of these books I have taught are the God tier, which God tier books that I've taught for me are books that I've taught them probably multiple times. I love to teach them a lot. My students like to study them. Like I've just had some of my best or most productive classroom experiences with these novels. These are just like novels that I absolutely cannot wait to teach again, that I kind of fall back on all of the time. They're just like, just peak, really. The next tier is faves that my students hated, which is books that I really like, or books that I think have, you know, real literary merit and value, but that my students just really didn't like or struggled with, and made their thoughts about how much they didn't like these particular books really, really transparent to me. So that one is kind of a fun category. The next one is would teach again. So it's kind of like just a middle ground. Like, I would teach it again. It went well. It wasn't like incredible amazing, but it went fine. The next tier is difficult but worth it, which these are books that presented a lot of teaching challenges for me or were really challenging for my students, for a number of different reasons, which I'll get into, I imagine, as I start to unpack some of these, but have real educational or literary merit or value or historical merit or value that it's important to still teach these. So there's a couple of those in here. And then the last one is please don't make me teach this again, which are the books that I taught them. I did not like teaching them. My students did not like studying them. We just didn't have a good time. Sometimes it was like this was a disappointing teaching experience or a frustrating teaching experience. And again, when I say please don't make me teach this again, I'm probably going to teach them again, just because some of them are texts that it's like I taught them because they do have a real place in a literary survey course where it's like you have to teach this book. That it's impossible to get around it, even if you don't want to teach it. So I've already been talking too long. Let's hop right into ranking these. So the first one on the list is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which I'm kind of like torn a little bit about where to put this. Part of me wants to put it in God tier. Part of me wants to put it in faves that my students hated, but they didn't hate it. A lot of them really, really liked it a lot, very much. I don't think they loved it as much as I do, obviously, but like it's one of my favorite books of all time. Or I want to maybe put it in Would Teach Again, where the truth of the matter is, I think I might put it there. Truth of the matter is, Picture of Dorian Gray is one of my favorite novels of all time. It's one of my favorite Gothic novels of all time. However, when I'm teaching an undergraduate course or like a British survey course and I have to choose one late Victorian Gothic novel, I'm probably not going to choose The Picture of Dorian Gray. I'll probably pick Jekyll and Hyde or Dracula over it, just because Jekyll and Hyde and Dracula allow me to kind of provide more useful and stimulating historical context for my students that kind of track well with other things I've probably already taught in that class, whereas Picture of Dorian Gray just requires so much esoteric historical context for my students. I like to include it because I love queer Gothic so much. I'll probably teach it again multiple times in my career. I've taught it once before, and I'll teach it again. Again, I'm not going to put it in God tier because it's not God tier. And again, my students didn't hate it, but I would teach it again. All right, the next one, I'm actually going to skip that one for right now just because that's kind of an oddball one that I want to have other books in conversation for. I'm just like, there's books that like this was taught in tandem with that will make it make more sense in just a second. The next one is Deo Gratias, which this is actually a graphic novel. It's a graphic novel about the Rwandan genocide, and it's a class that I taught this in a class about metamorphosis. Our protagonist becomes more and more complicit in this genocide, and as he becomes more complicit in the genocide, he starts to transform like into a dog, and it's really a novel about like dehumanization and things like that, and becoming dehumanized through acts of violence. And I'm gonna put it in please don't make me teach this again. And it's again a text that I might come back to for students. However, it was one that my students really struggled with, both because the nature of the narrative, it kind of hops all over the place. It's not a linear narrative, and if you're not really well versed at reading graphic narrative and like the very subtle cues of when we've hopped time, it can be kind of confusing. Also, just the content, it is extremely violent, extremely graphic. It does feature sexual assault. It was a big content warnings for this one, and that I had to give to my students, and it was a hard text for all of us to kind of work through just because of how uncomfortable and difficult the content was. So it's like, I think it's important to talk about, obviously the Rwandan genocide, and it's a difficult text to teach. However, it just didn't go well. I think there are possibly better texts that I could have picked. So it's one that I'll probably maybe teach again at some point, but not in the near future. All right. Next is Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, which this is a Victorian long-form poem about two little girls who meet a band of goblins in the woods, and the goblins are like a metaphor for like sexual experience, that they want you to come and eat their fruit, and one sister is very virtuous and does not want to eat the fruit, and the other sister, of course, wants to gorge herself on the fruit, and then in true Victorian fashion, the sister who gorges herself on the fruit starts to like waste away and die, and then the virtuous sister has to save her. It's all very like Victorian, putting women into diametric opposition with each other, that you're either a Madonna or a whore, like that kind of thing, but kind of subverted. I think it's a more interesting poem than just that. It's a poem that I taught in a horror for children class, because there is some argument about whether or not this poem is intended for children. It's written in what would be considered children's verse, and Christina Rossetti herself has kind of, as though she's still alive. She, at different points in her career, said that it was for kids, but then in private correspondence would say it's not. Again, it's very sexual. I taught it alongside Jim Henson's Labyrinth, because it tracked really well. And my students didn't despise it, but they didn't love it as much as I do, because I really like Goblin Market. And my students were just kind of like, what is this? I highly recommend reading it. It's a really fascinating little poem. And I mean, if you love Jim Henson's Labyrinth, you should definitely check this out. The next one on our list is Kafka's Metamorphosis, which I'm going to put under difficult but worth it. It's a hard text to teach, but it's one of those texts where it's like, you should be familiar with this a little bit. And there are some really interesting political resonances that can be worked through in a classroom. So I would recommend it. Again, hard to teach, not my favorite to teach, but it was worth teaching. Next one is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. I also taught that in the class for horror for kids. With the original illustrations, which was very important, because at the time I did this, the original illustrations had been removed from contemporary editions, which I now believe they've been put back. Because literally the whole point of those books are Stephen Gammell's terrifying illustrations. Like, that's what made those such cult classics. So to change the illustrations is just like, why? So we did do a lot of visual analysis with this one of the original illustrations. I'm going to put that under, I would teach it again. My students and I did have fun with it. It wasn't God tier, and they did like it. So I would definitely teach it again. Ovid's Metamorphosis, I'm going to put in God tier. No, whoop, God tier. I have taught the Metamorphosis, or Metamorphoses, excuse me, I'm still thinking of Kafka. The Metamorphoses multiple times. I've taught many stories out of the Metamorphoses. I'm very interested in like transformation and metamorphosis as tropes and metaphors in fiction. So I have taught it in multiple classes. Like, we've done Hades and Persephone, we've done Orpheus and Eurydice, Tereus and Philomel, Lycaon, I've done a lot of stories out of here. Daphne and Apollo. It's a really useful text to talk about things just like ancient literature, to talk about sexual assault and its glorification in Western culture, and art. It's just been a really useful text. So I would definitely teach it again. I will teach it again. I've taught it at least 4 times, so I'm definitely putting that in God tier. The next one is William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, which I'm going to put in under faves that my students hated. Again, they didn't hate it, but they didn't like it a lot. I think of the Romantic poets, it was probably their least favorite, and I think that might just be because his poetry here, at least, is so didactic. Here's the catch, though. Here's the thing, is that like in class discussions, I think that they found like Percy Shelley and Lord Byron more interesting than William Blake's poetry. Now, William Blake as a man they thought was very interesting because he was something else. But the poems they did not enjoy as much. That said, when it came time for them to write their essays, their close reading analysis essays of pick a poem and analyze it, they all like picked Blake, because it's so not easy to analyze, but like the metaphors are so upfront. Like, it's, again, it feels almost like children's poetry. I encountered this collection the first time in a children's literature class. And I really love it. The illustrations are all gorgeous. William Blake did all his own illustrations for it. He was really an incredible painter. I almost enjoy his painting more than his poetry. He's a fantastic poet, but gorgeous artwork that is so ahead of its time and surreal and bizarre. Like, he's just great. I love him. My students were kind of like, okay. Next one after that is Coraline. Would definitely teach Coraline again. My students and I really enjoyed it. Coraline is probably my favorite Neil Gaiman novel, full stop. Well, there's an addendum to that, but I'll get to that in a moment. But it's my favorite, like, Neil Gaiman on his own novel, I think. And I taught it alongside Alice's Adventures in Wonderland as part of like a unit, and my students really dug it, and I would definitely teach it again. Next one is The Grimm's Brothers, which is definitely God tier, as with Ovid's Metamorphoses. I have taught stories by the Grimms so many times, like half a dozen times at least, if I'm not under exaggerating. I've taught Hansel and Gretel a million times. I have taught Cinderella, Snow White. I teach a lot of fairy tales, honestly. So like I'd like to take the Grimms and let's broaden that out a little bit. Like not just the Grimms, but like Charles Perrault and Hans Christian Andersen. So just like Western fairy tales as like a catch-all would be God tier for me, because I have taught those stories so many times. I've taught Beauty and the Beast a million times, Red Riding Hood a million times, Hansel and Gretel a million times. And they're just so useful. They really are for undergraduate level literary analysis, because they're stories that students have some kind of base familiarity with, and it's always fun to kind of open them up a little bit and provide historical context, or maybe in some instances that they're great to teach psychoanalysis with, which I'm not a big psychoanalyst person, but you have to sometimes teach psychoanalysis when you're talking about literary criticism. They're great for that. They're fascinating pieces of historical fiction. They're fascinating to talk about in the context of like the rise of populism in Europe in the 19th century, which is going to eventually lead to things like Nazism and fascism 100 years later. They're just such great teaching tools, and I adore them. I adore teaching them. So those are definitely God tier for me. Next one is Apuleius' The Golden Ass. I'm going to put this one under, please don't make me teach this again. Not because my students and I didn't have fun with it, which Apuleius' The Golden Ass is the story of a young Roman aristocrat who's kind of a jerk. He's very arrogant, who through his own meddling gets turned into a donkey and has to try to figure out how to become a man again, like turn himself back into a man. And he goes on all these misadventures that are really troubling. Let's put it that way. Golden Ass is one of our only complete Roman novels that we have from antiquity, and it is aggressively Roman. It has orgies, it has bestiality, it has just murder, violence, cults, just every weird thing you can possibly imagine a Roman novel would be about. It's all here. And my students and I really had a hell of a time talking through this one, especially given all of like the bestiality that is in this. There is bestiality in this because the Romans be Romaning, you know, and it's not one that I would necessarily want to teach again anytime soon. I probably will come back to it at some point, but like it was just such a difficult text to teach. Also, just the prose was difficult for my students as well, just because it's such an old novel and a different kind of novel than they're used to. I taught it because it was important. This was a class of metamorphosis again. Both the content was about metamorphosis, but like that this is one of our first intact novels, like narrative prose novels as a form, and it's important to kind of like look back at where literature and how literature was transforming into what we would now recognize as like the novel. My students and I, it was rough. I'm just gonna move on because it was rough. There was bestiality. It was bonkers. This book is bonkers. I taught it alongside The Emperor's New Groove, which my students, they really enjoyed that more. No surprise. But it was fun to teach it because we taught it alongside Emperor's New Groove, which is one of those novels that it's like considered to be like one of Disney's like original stories. And it's like, well, technically there's a Roman novel that's literally the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Emperor's New Groove. You just watch Emperor's New Groove. You'll be fine. You don't need to read this. Like, there's a lot less bestiality and sexual assault in the Emperor's New Groove. Next one, Frankenstein, God tier. God tier. Frankenstein is such a rich text. You can really teach so many different modes of literary criticism with this book. You can teach so many different, how do I want to put this? Like different ideas and ideologies from its period. So you get like this really great, rich historical context. Like it's a great novel to teach if you're talking about like early 19th century history. It's great to talk about in like the development of science fiction and the fantastic. It's just such a good book anyway. My students sometimes have difficulty with it just because the prose is so purple, which, you know, has a lot to do with Percy. It's Percy Shelley amending Mary Shelley's writing, but also amending. Also just that Victor Frankenstein is so unlikable, which I'm like, I agree. I can't stand Victor either. I really hate Victor Frankenstein a lot. Incidentally, the class I'm teaching this summer is a class that is entirely based around Frankenstein and its intertexts. So that's God tier. The Complete Stories of Flannery O'Connor. difficult but worth it, I think. O'Connor's stories are really hard to teach just because there are no easy answers in her stories, and sometimes the content is really difficult. The characters are so strange. A lot of the social issues are just difficult to talk about, but worth talking about, things like racism and disability. And sometimes they're hard to teach just because, like, the ethical quandary at the center of it is not easy to work out. Her morals are not super transparent, and students sometimes kind of like struggle with that. But they're definitely worth teaching. I highly recommend them. I've taught her stories several times now in, I think, like 3 or 4 different classes. Like, she's just great. Okay, now this next one is weird. Okay, bear with me here. Which is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I have taught multiple times because it's my favorite Harry Potter book, and again, it gels and tracks with things like Metamorphosis just because of the animaguses and the werewolves and all the other things in it. I'm putting this one under please don't make me teach this again. I am so burnt out right now on teaching and talking about Harry Potter in an academic scenario. I am so burnt out on it. I have taught this book multiple times. I have just gotten done talking about it in a section of my dissertation chapter that I just finished in February. I'm just sick of it. Usually when I teach this, I will teach like probably the first Harry Potter film, Prisoner of Azkaban, and then like fandom study stuff. So I'll teach fan works about Harry Potter. Usually I'm teaching Harry Potter because I want to talk about fandom studies. And every year it becomes more and more difficult because every year my students get younger and they have less and less familiarity with Harry Potter or its fandom. I've found, even though the Potter fandom still endures in certain corners, it's not like that. When I was my students' age, it's like everybody knew about this. And if you were an English major, you probably like participated in that fandom. And it's just becoming more and more tricky to teach. I'm just tired of it. I'm burnt out. I don't want to teach it again in the immediate future, basically. I will absolutely be teaching Harry Potter again at some point. I just don't want to do it right now. I'm tired of talking about Harry Potter with my students and their terrible opinions about it. Like, I'm tired. I'm just so tired. To go back to the first one that I skipped, like, this is related to this. I have taught The Shoebox Project by Jada Jones and Danielle Bennett multiple times in tandem with Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which, if you're not familiar with The Shoebox Project, it is a long-form piece of fan fiction from about, I think, 2005 or so, so like the heyday of Potter fandom. It's kind of a gen fic. It's about the Marauders at their time during their time at Hogwarts as students, and it is a Wolfstar fic. So like Remus and Sirius do fall in love. And so I have taught it to my students several times to kind of give them a better sense of, you know, what fan fiction can actually look like, what it did look like in the heyday of Harry Potter. And it often surprises my students. They're surprised that it's so well written, which, okay. Shoebox Project is so well written. It is so good. It is one of my favorite novels ever, which sounds bizarre. I've taught it 3 times. I will definitely want to teach it again. I'm going to put it in under just would teach again. I did also talk about that in my dissertation chapter, and yet I'm not sick of that, so interpret that however you like. But if you want a really excellent piece of Harry Potter fanfiction, even if you don't ship Wolfstar, like which is Remus and Sirius, don't even worry about it. Just, it's an excellent piece of Potter fan lore, and I highly recommend it. It's one that, like, in 2005, if you were in that fandom, you had some base familiarity with it. And I love it. I want to print it out and put it on my bookcase. Like, really bad. All right, next one is Toni Morrison's Beloved. That is God tier. I've taught that one multiple times. Again, like Frankenstein, it is so rich. It is such a great entryway to so many different kinds of conversations about history, about race, about the Gothic, about just American literature. It's which I highly recommend Beloved if you haven't read Beloved. It's about a haunted house and slavery and the ghost of a baby. That's all I'm going to say. It's really dark. It's really beautifully written. It is so upsetting and difficult to get through. Again, raises some really interesting ethical questions that my students and I have worked through, which I thought would be questions that my students would have more problems with, but they really didn't, which was nice. And students have consistently enjoyed Beloved. Anytime I've taught Beloved, my students and I have a really productive conversation about it. So, God tier. Neil Gaiman's Anansi Boys, I would teach again. Absolutely. Anansi Boys is one of my other favorite Neil Gaiman novels. The thing about Neil Gaiman for me is that, like, I really love urban fantasy, but something that Gaiman's work is often lacking for me is humor. Like, I find his work so dry sometimes, like American Gods is so dry, or like Stardust, I prefer the film Stardust to the novel Stardust. I just do, because the film has that more kind of, it just has a sense of humor about itself. It's more Princess Bride than it is, you know, high fantasy. And Anansi Boys has a sense of humor. Anansi Boys is a kind of spiritual prequel to American Gods about Anansi, the West African spider god of mischief, who makes appearances in American Gods, and here he is the father of these two boys who have to kind of cope with their father's death. That's the setup, and it's so great, and like deal with the fact that they realize that they're demigods, and it's such a good book. It's so funny. I taught it in a world literature course because we talked a lot about West African mythology in that class, and my students really liked it. I highly enjoyed it. Again, it's like in my top 3 Neil Gaiman novels that I really love, so definitely recommend that. Next one is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I'm putting that under God tier just because, reader, there is really no Victorian novel that is better suited for teaching the novel and literary criticism. I literally first encountered Jane Eyre for the first time in an Introduction to Literature course where we just read Jane Eyre, like the whole semester, and we learned every different kind of literary critical lens: feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, psychoanalysis, new historicism, just anything you can imagine, critical race theory, just any kind of mode of entry or inquiry into literature that you can imagine, we studied and learned about, and we learned it by reading and interpreting Jane Eyre and reading secondary criticism about Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is such a rich, strange, frustrating book, and I have taught it multiple times. My students get hilariously into it, always. They always hate Mr. Rochester about as much as I do, but they get so into the melodrama of it all. Like, I literally screened the Michael Fassbender film for them once, and like my kids were like whooping and going ooh like the whole movie, and it was the weirdest thing to me because it's such like a quiet, subdued period piece. It made them so rowdy. It was just really funny, and I'm like, well, I'm glad that you guys are understanding like what it would have been like for people reading this in the 1840s, because this is exactly the reaction they would have had to it. It's just a great text to teach. It's such a useful text to teach. I'm probably going to be teaching it in fall, again, actually in a young adult class that I'm going to be teaching, just because Jane Eyre for a long time was taught and sold as a young adult novel because it is a Bildungsroman. So highly recommend that. I'm going to find the other one because speaking of the Brontes, there it is. Wuthering Heights, I'm putting under faves that my students hated, because I love Wuthering Heights. It's bonkers. My students hate Wuthering Heights. Every time they hate it. It's so funny to me. They have such a difficult time keeping all of like the families straight, like the family trees. I have to like just provide them with family trees to help them out. They hate all of the characters so much to the degree that they just can't enjoy the book. Whereas I'm like, yeah, they're all garbage. Like, every character in this book is garbage, and that's why I like it, because I like books with really garbagey characters. I like books about terrible people. Heathcliff and Cathy are both so reprehensible, but I find that book fascinating because it's like, this is not a love story, you guys. This is a story about like revenge, right? And the destructive nature of revenge and the destructive nature of passion and all this other stuff that Emily Bronte, really understood. And like, it's such a good book and such a strange book. My students hate it. And I know that for a fact because I asked them once, like at the end of that class, which was a British literature survey, I surveyed them like, what was your least favorite book of the year? And they all said Wuthering Heights. They hated it, but I love it. So I'm gonna teach it again. It's an important book, okay? And it's a funny book to me, and it's just, Heathcliff is such a great villain, just a villain. just a villain, the way only the Brontes can write, just these villainous scumbag men that just, oh God, I love the Bronte sisters so much. The next one is The Robber Bridegroom by Eudora Welty. I'm putting this under Please Don't Make Me Teach This Again. I don't know why I didn't gel with this book and my students didn't gel with this book. We did not gel with this book, which The Robber Bridegroom is a Southern Gothic novel, more of a actually Southern magical realist novel that is based on the Grimm's fairy tale, The Robber Bridegroom. And I thought it would work better in my class, and it just didn't. My students didn't really like it. I didn't like teaching it. I'm probably not teaching that one again. The Stories of Edgar Allan Poe, God tier. I've taught them a lot. And again, as with the Grimm's brothers or like Ovid's Metamorphoses, they're such great, short, little bite-sized chunks that are so rich and really allow for really productive conversations about, again, feminism, critical race studies, Southern history, American literature, the form of the short story. Just like, they're just great to teach. My students always like them. We always have a fun time talking about them. I love Poe a lot. Always have. I did when I was a baby, and I do now. So Poe is God tier for me. I love teaching Edgar Allan Poe. The next one, okay. This is The Devil in Love by Jacques Cazot. I'm putting that one under Please Don't Make Me Teach This Again, because this one was probably my worst experience teaching anything ever. The Devil in Love is a late 18th century French fantastical novel. I was teaching it in the world history class, which was about the fantastic, and I really wanted to teach the French fantastic, which was really doing interesting things during the French Revolution, just as a kind of setup for later texts that we were going to look at. And I chose The Devil in Love just because it's so wild. It's about the devil falling in love with this young man, and then the devil gender bends himself into a young woman to try to seduce the young man. And it's just like, it's queer and subversive and bizarre, and the writer totally got guillotined later, and it's just a really interesting text to teach, or so I thought. The problem was that it's very hard to find in print, really hard to find in print, and I did find a version on, I think it was Project Gutenberg, and assumed it would be the full original edition. It wasn't. It was the later excised edition. So in the original version of the story, the devil does seduce the young man and they have sex. In the excised version, that was considered to be way too blasphemous, and so that was taken out. And they do not have sex, and the devil does not succeed in seducing the young man. So I'm trying to teach this story to my students, having read my print copy of it, the original version, while all of them read the Gutenberg file that I linked them to, the excised version. And so I'm talking about how the devil and this guy had sex, and they're all looking at me like I'm just certifiable. And I slowly realized that, oh my God, you guys didn't get the original ending, did you? And they're like, no. So I done goofed. I assumed, I didn't read through the Gutenberg, like the entire novel on Project Gutenberg before I assigned it to them. I just assumed it'd be a free open access version of the book. I always try to give my students like open access of public domain novels when I can to save them money. And it bit me in the butt really hard that time. It's also just a difficult novel to talk about. Just late 18th century novels are so difficult to talk about with undergraduates anyway. They're so strange and esoteric and just like, what? And this one in particular is so what? That my students just, it didn't go well. So I'm not going to teach that again for a while. Not at least until I can find an open access version of the original story with the original ending intact. So I don't look like I'm bonkers, like when I'm talking about how the devil seduced this guy. I'm like, they're looking at me like I'm like some kind of deviant, and I'm like, okay, maybe a little, but I'm not making this up. All right, next one is Shakespeare's Macbeth. Definitely would teach again. I love teaching Macbeth. I just love Macbeth. I taught that in World Lit too, when we were talking about fantasy, which it was either between Macbeth or I could have taught The Tempest, which probably would have made more sense, but I didn't want to teach The Tempest, honestly. I just didn't feel like it. I really wanted to teach Macbeth. My students always love Macbeth. They love Lady Macbeth as a villain. They love her. They're always like rooting for her, which makes me laugh. And they just always hate Macbeth so much. So it's always a fun text to teach. The Witches, I'm going to put this one under faves that my students hated. They didn't hate it, but I love Roald Dahl's The Witches so much. It's just like an important childhood book to me, and my students just didn't really have that much of a response to it. They were just kind of like, okay. Emily Carroll's Through the Woods, I'm going to put in God tier. I have taught it 1,000 times. Usually in tandem with, again, either the Grimm's fairy tales or fairy tales by Charles Perrault. So like I'll teach Red Riding Hood and then I'll teach a couple stories out of Through the Woods, or I'll teach Bluebeard and then I'll teach a couple stories from Through the Woods. Because Through the Woods is very similar to like Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, where a lot of these are kind of riffs on or drawing from like the Western cultural imaginary of like fairy tales, especially Red Riding Hood and Bluebeard and things like that. They're horror comics. I've used them quite a bit, and they're all short. They're like short stories, but graphic. And I've used them multiple times to teach like how to read graphic narrative, like how to analyze graphic narrative, like how do we do a visual analysis of a comics panel. Because her use of just like the gutter and text and how text looks in the, she's so good. And I've taught it many, many times. Have done visual analysis of her panels with my students as a classroom activity and had great success with it. Just love. The Bad Beginning by Lemonine Snicket, which I taught in the horror for kids class. I would teach this again, definitely. That one was an interesting experience for me just because like my students were not as familiar with that series as, again, people from my generation would be. This is also before the Netflix series, which I'm not super crazy about. Like everybody loves that Netflix series so much, and I'm just kind of like, it's okay. Like just aesthetically, it just didn't do it for me. It just didn't feel like the books for me. And I don't. Anyway, that's a rant for another day. But like it's good. Don't misunderstand me. It didn't work for me as an adaptation of this. And my students weren't really familiar with it. They did like it, but it's one of those times when it's like you love a thing so much and your students just don't. They just don't. And again, their reaction to it, they liked this more than The Witches. The Witches, they were just kind of like, this is weird and unpleasant, and I'm not enjoying this. This one they did like more, and we had a more productive conversation about. Next one is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Difficult but worth it. This is one of the most difficult books to teach. I think that is true for most literary instructors. Heart of Darkness is such a difficult text to teach because it is so, so racist. And it is such a complex beast to try to grapple with because at once it is so anti-imperialist, and so it's a great novel to teach about when you're trying to talk about anti-imperialist sentiments in Britain towards the end of the Victorian period. But at the same time, then it's like it's so anti-imperialist, but it's so racist. And so it's a difficult text to teach. And one that sometimes I don't always feel comfortable teaching, and I will often have like one of my colleagues who works in critical race studies do a guest lecture for me, just because like in case it's not really obvious, I am white. And sometimes it's like I really would prefer to have a black voice of authority at the front of the room for these kinds of conversations. So I have done that a couple of times. It's a novel that is, nevertheless, we always have really generative conversations come out of this in a classroom, where it's like, this is unpleasant content, and we all acknowledge that this is unpleasant content. Now, what do we do with it? Because this is considered to be one of the great canon classics, and it's like, okay, well, what do we do with this now? And so it's a great opportunity to have a conversation about like the canon and race and what is the value of reading these kinds of books that are so racist. Like, is there any value? Is it worth reading? So it's a very interesting book to teach for those reasons, especially. And one that has it's a book that's wormed its way into, again, our cultural imaginary to such an intense degree, because of like things like Apocalypse Now, that it's a book that it's like students should have some base familiarity with. Like you should kind of know what Heart of Darkness is. You're going to see references to it at some point in your life. So difficult, worth it. Would teach it again. Again, the way that I've said that I prefer to have at least one guest lecture from a colleague, a person of color who does critical race studies. Also, you cannot teach this without secondary criticism from voices of color. Like, you just can't do that. You cannot teach this book and then teach a bunch of secondary criticism written by white academics about why it's not racist or why it's okay to still teach this. You cannot do that. It's just not going to happen. So don't do that. So if you attend to those issues, then this can be a really productive conversation. The next one is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. God tier. Like Through the Woods. For the same reason, you notice how like so many of the God tier books are like collections of short stories or like fables and things. Like, they're just so useful to teach. Bloody Chamber is, wow, my voice cracked. I'm still kind of having difficulty regulating my breathing because I'm still recovering from bronchitis. Which I picked the worst time to have bronchitis, did I not? So excuse me if I'm like panting or breathing hard or my voice cracks. You notice a lot of the God tiers are like collections of fables and fairy tales. And The Bloody Chamber is a collection of feminist fairy tales from the 1970s. They're like revisions of a lot of fairy tales like Red Riding Hood and Bluebeard and Sleeping Beauty and things like that. Angela Carter would have said that they are not revisions, that I'm not rewriting these, I'm just mining out what subtexts of sexuality and violence and feminism were already there and just bringing them to the forefront. She's like, I'm not rewriting them, I'm just mining out what was already there and bringing it to the surface. They're really fun to teach, and I love to teach these. Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Difficult but worth it. This is such a bear of a novel to try to teach. So Master and Margarita, The Master and Margarita, excuse me, I always say Master and the Margarita as though he's holding a drink. The Master and Margarita is a Russian, a Soviet satire novel written during the reign of Stalin. And it's explicitly about Stalinism. It's anti-Stalinist. It's such a strange book. Like, we're hopping between all of these different stories, and one of them is like a magical realist story set in Stalinist Russia, and then like another one is about like the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and like Pontius Pilate is a character, and it's just the weirdest book. And there's a talking cat who smokes cigarettes, and Margarita like turns into a witch and flies away on a broomstick. It's just like magical realism out the wazoo. And it requires so much contextualizing of Soviet history for students who probably don't know a lot about it at their age. So that made it difficult to teach, is that I was constantly teaching both, like we would teach, like talk about the novel and then also have to talk about like Soviet history, and here's the history of like the 1940s and the rest of the world. Like it was one of those novels where it's like historical context, you cannot not teach it because this is literally an anti-Stalinist critique. So, and it's long, it's like, she's thick. I taught that in the world literature class about the Fantastic, and I think that if you like American Gods, or you like oh, what is that book called? What is wrong with my brain? Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell? The Susanna Clarke novel about the wizards. I'm like brain dead today. If you like that book, I think you might like Master and the Margarita. Just because it's very magical realist, but like very historically situated. And very interesting. It's an interesting book, but it was a slog for the undergrads. But it was worth it, and I would teach it again. We had really generative conversations about it. And again, they learned a lot about the history of Stalinism, so, which is, you know, not as immediately unrelevant as you would like to think it is, or would hope it would have been by now, but it's still pretty relevant. The Haunting of Hill House, I would teach again. It's one of my favorite novels ever. Again, my students were like, about it, so it's a good book. Okay, you guys, like, there's sometimes it's like when you're teaching, you're just like, this is a good book, and they're like, okay, and you're like, no, it is, just listen. The Haunting of Hill House is one of my favorite novels. I taught it in a class on American Gothic. I absolutely would teach it again in a class on American Gothic. It's also decently short, which is helpful in a survey course, so you can teach lots of different kinds of things. So I would definitely teach it again. White Sargasso Sea, I'm going to put under faves that my students hated. White Sargasso Sea is a post-colonial critique of Jane Eyre. So it's Jane Eyre retold through the eyes of Bertha Mason, so the mad woman in the attic, Rochester's first wife, who's from Jamaica. And so it's very much about like race and the ways in which Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic, has been vilified, and trying to reclaim her as a character and give her a voice. And this was written in the 70s when post-colonial theory was kind of finally coming to the forefront in the academy. And it's a good novel. It's a magical realist novel. Like there is voodoo in it, and it's really interesting because, again, Jane Eyre is a realist novel, but there is a lot of magic and fairy tale stuff in that book. So it tracks really well. I love it. My students struggled with it a little bit. They just hate Mr. Rochester so much in it, which I'm like, you're supposed to. Like, he's not good. Legend of Sleepy Hollow, would definitely teach it again. It's a great class, a great text for American Gothic survey. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, God tier. Again, this is like, that's why I said that if I was going to pick one late Victorian Gothic novel to teach, it'd be Jekyll and Hyde, not Dorian Gray. Even though I love Dorian Gray more. Jekyll and Hyde is just so rich, and again, a great gateway to a lot of conversations about a lot of Victorian beliefs about science and race and all sorts of things, and criminality. Like, it's just, you get a lot more productive conversation out of Jekyll and Hyde, I have found, than for Dorian Gray, or at least in an elementary, like, intro to British literature survey class. This helps contextualize things historically more than Picture of Dorian Gray did, in my experience anyway. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I don't want to teach it again. I don't have a choice. Again, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is a book that, if you are teaching a class about the history of children's literature, or a class on the golden age of children's literature, you do not have a choice. You have got to teach Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Or Through the Looking Glass, which possibly I would have enjoyed teaching Through the Looking Glass more, maybe. I don't know why I did not enjoy teaching this. I did not enjoy teaching Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. My students did not enjoy studying it with me. I think there's something about quantifying the silliness of it all, like quantifying nonsense, that just kind of took the joy out of it. For me, I don't know. I don't want to teach it again. I enjoyed teaching like Coraline and Pan's Labyrinth as its intertext. I enjoyed teaching those more than teaching the novel itself, which just, I don't know. It didn't go well. Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. Faves that my students hated. I love The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. My students were like, what the hell is going on? Benito Cereno by Herman Melville, I would put under teach again. This is a very interesting Gothic novel that is set aboard a ship. It's about slavery, because Gothic novels are usually about, you know, archaic, outdated systems and hierarchies that are starting to rot. And this one is about slavery because Herman Melville was an outspoken abolitionist. And Benito Cereno is a very kind of interesting, complex Gothic novel with a great twist. And I love teaching it. It's tricky to teach because I don't want to give away the twist at the end of the book because it's so important to enjoying it. But my students really like to read it just because we love to talk about what an idiot the narrator is. It produces really great conversations about race and slavery in the 19th century and the Gothic, and like ways that the Gothic doesn't just have to be like a castle, that it could be aboard like a slave ship, and that it's still, all the tropes are still here, all of the signposts are still here. So I love teaching Benito Cereno. I actually wrote my master's thesis on Benito Cereno. Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I would definitely teach it again. This is my favorite Neil Gaiman novel. But the thing is, he co-wrote it with Terry Pratchett, and you can see Terry Pratchett's fingerprints all over it. And that's what makes it so great, I think. Because again, I love Gaiman's content, his aesthetic. I love urban fantasy, but his books rarely have a sense of humor or whimsy to them. Terry Pratchett, I have enjoyed a lot of the Discworld books I've read. However, they're more high fantasy than I typically enjoy, but he's so funny. And when you marry the two of them together, you get Good Omens, which is one of my favorite books of all time. My students loved it. This was before the Amazon series came out, actually, which would be interesting to teach this again now that the Amazon series is out, because I feel like when I taught this, none of my students had ever heard of it, and now I feel like at least a percentage of them would have heard of it because of the Amazon series, which turned into such a surprise smash hit. I prefer the book to the series. Again, I'm definitely not a purist when it comes to like, oh, the book is better. However, both Series of Unfortunate Events and Good Omens are books that I do enjoy more than the series. Even though the series they're good, they're fine. Like, there's nothing really wrong with them unless you want to get really nitpicky and like bananas, which I do about those two just because I love them so much. But I do prefer the books, and I love Good Omens. Oh my God. Taught it in a British literature survey about monsters, and because I wanted to talk about the devil and Adam as the Antichrist. But that's the thing I don't like about the miniseries, really, is that like Adam's narrative is just so underserved there, where it's so much more important in the book. And I love Aziraphale and Crowley as much as the next dumb homosexual, but like they're not the main characters of the book. Anyway, I'll literally rant about this for an hour. But I would definitely teach it again. Other Voices, Other Rooms by Truman Capote. I don't want to teach this again. I'm not saying never, but I really don't want to teach it again. I taught this in my Southern Gothic class. It's Truman's first novel, which is deeply autobiographical, about a young man who goes to move with his aunt and uncle and father, his aunt and father, excuse me, and his uncle Randolph, who's also there. And they just live in this bizarre Southern Gothic mansion, and it's about Joel, our main character, who's just Truman Capote, coming to terms with like his queerness in the American South in like the 1930s, and queerness being this very kind of Gothic experience. And so I wanted to teach my kids this novel just because it was important to me that we had queer Southern literature and that we talked about queer Gothic in a Southern Gothic class. My students just had such a hard time with it. They had such a hard time with it. Again, my students who were not LGBTQ had a hard time with it, which is to be expected, that's fine. My students who were LGBTQ had a hard time with it because they felt that this is very toxic representation. And I'm like, it's a book written in the late 50s, honey. Like, it's not going to be ideal rep. Even though it was written by a queer person, it's like your idea of queer rep and his idea of queer rep are very different. And it was just like, it was just a struggle every day to teach it, and just wasn't, I don't know, like I didn't enjoy teaching it. Again, it's not a book that I'm even particularly attached to, really. It's just a bear to teach. Like, it is complicated because, again, my students who were upset by the rep, they're right to be. There are troubling things in this book, like really troubling things in this book, which are pretty typical of queer fiction in the mid-century in America. So that was generative to have those conversations, but it just was kind of a drag. The whole book was a drag. If I taught Capote again, I would rather teach In Cold Blood, which that wouldn't have worked for a Southern Gothic class, but In Cold Blood is one of my favorite books ever, so I would rather, I think, teach In Cold Blood if I teach Capote again. Other Voices of the Rooms is one that I think I will eventually come back to and teach again, just not for a while. I did not have a good experience teaching it. It wasn't bad, it just was like, okay, that sure was a book that we read. Like, it just, I don't know. The last one is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is one I would absolutely teach again. Carmilla is one that you guys are maybe familiar with if you know anything about the vampire novel, because there was a very well-received web series about it a couple years ago. Carmilla is a sapphic vampire novel. It predates Dracula by 20, 30 years. And it's just great. It's about this young woman, Laura, who falls in love with a vampire, Carmilla, and it is, like, remarkably sympathetic to homoerotic desire and sapphic love for a novel written in the Victorian period. It's kind of shocking. It doesn't have a happy ending exactly, but the fact that it's sympathetic at all is the most you can kind of hope for a novel written in, like, what, 1872? It's an interesting book. I highly recommend Carmilla. If you like vampire fiction, you have to check out Carmilla. It's like Dracula and Carmilla are like the two biggies. And it's just fun to see, like, a female vampire too. Like, those are always fun. Alright, so that's it. That is everything now arranged. This feels about right. This was really fun and really interesting to kind of like stop and reflect. I talked way too long. This video was only supposed to be like 30 minutes. It's now like an hour, just because I was so deep in my teaching feels. But I hope you guys enjoyed this or thought it was kind of interesting at all to kind of see a teacher's thoughts on her own pedagogy. and how I think it went. And I will see you guys in the next few days. Again, I'm going to be filming, again, my wrap-up for the month of April, the OWL's Readathon Challenge. I also want to film a book haul video, and at some point our Owl Crates will be coming, which I want to do an unboxing for that. Again, Owl Crate got delayed significantly because of the COVID-19 shipping restrictions. So those are not being shipped out till like today. Like, I'm filming this at the end of the month, and like today, usually they would have been shipped out 10 days ago. But small businesses are just out here trying to make it work. I would also like to film like an indie tarot deck haul at some point, just because I've been supporting like small businesses and independent artists as much as I can right now, because it's like I am still getting a paycheck because I'm an instructor, and not everyone is that lucky. But anyway, I will see you guys later. Hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.